There's a recent Quinnipiac University poll that asked about terror. They asked about terror and what Americans see as the biggest source of terror. Now, according to this Quinnipiac poll, American voters are actually far more concerned about threats from terrorism, not from abroad, not from the refugees from Syria. No, they're far more concerned about homegrown terrorism from jihadists. You've got to be kidding. If we're talking about homegrown terrorism, domestic terrorism, whether or not it's jihadis, Islamic terrorism, or whether or not it's Christian terrorism, or whether or not it's anti-government terrorism, or terrorism of any other stripe in America, an aggregate of all of them, I would say you are absolutely right. Yes, we face far more danger from homegrown domestic terrorists of all stripes. U.S. born. We're talking U.S. born here. We're talking U.S. born. You are more likely to be killed by a homegrown domestic terrorist than someone from overseas coming in, especially a refugee. But if you're talking just jihadis, which is what they're saying in this Quinnipiac poll, then you are absolutely wrong. Okay. Once again, let's get into the results of this whole thing, right? Now, 16% of people, 16% said the potential of terrorists lurking, that's their words, not mine, among Syrian refugees posed the greatest threat to the United States. Do you know how much of a threat Syrian potential jihadists, terrorists, hiding among Syrian refugees is? Like zero. There's almost no chance. Why? Because we have the strictest, and I've went over this before, we have some of the strictest refugee vetting processes in the entire world. It takes an average of 18 months or longer for a refugee to even touch American soil. And until that point, they live in refugee camps. Does it make any sense for a terrorist to hide among the refugees? Absolutely not. It's not practical. You could do it. Sure, I guess. You'd have to be a pretty convincing terrorist. You'd have to hide your tracks pretty well. But what makes it impractical is the waiting. Is having to go through all that stuff when it's just easier to come through as a guest. Or on business. It makes more sense to do that than to hide among the refugees. That's why it shouldn't be a concern. And luckily, most Americans, only about 16%, think that that's likely. Most Americans are like, nah, they're not hiding among the refugees. We're not really worried about that. Now, I want to get to something later on in the poll connected to this that absolutely infuriates me. But first, let's get through some of the other numbers on this. Now, 17% said that radicalized foreign visitors, so people that, for example, were radicalized, were born in like Saudi Arabia, or born in Qatar, or born, just somewhere else, foreign born, but that got radicalized through Islamic terrorism, right? Coming over to the United States, only 17% of Americans are worried about that happening. Okay, small amount. A majority, though, of 58% saw born-and-bred Americans that are radicalized, that became jihadists, as the most pressing threat of all. And this isn't Republicans. This is among all party ideological age and gender lines. So people are more worried about Joe from Oklahoma or Ahmed from Ohio becoming radicalized by ISIS and carrying out terrorist attacks. Now, we had something like that just happen. We actually had some people in San Bernardino who are American This guy was American. He went to Saudi Arabia. He brought back a wife. They were radicalized, and they shot and killed 14 people. I can understand that. I can understand why people think that. But it's not just, and I want to point this out, it's not just Islamic fundamentalism. Just last week, we had Robert Deere, who is a Christian domestic terrorist, obviously born and bred in the United States, attack a Planned Parenthood. No more baby parts. No more baby parts. That was a clear political, ideological agenda. That attack was motivated, I think, in my opinion at least, it was motivated by all the rhetoric against Planned Parenthood. That was a political agenda. Therefore, terrorism. This guy, we're not sure. The San Bernardino shooters, we're not exactly sure what their motive was. They're still investigating. But he was a Muslim, so automatically people are starting to tie him with ISIS. Now, if you go to Saudi Arabia doesn't like ISIS, despite the fact that they're almost identical in their beliefs. The Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia and ISIS, right? They all have a very strict fundamentalist Islamic ideology. But as nations, they hate each other. Really weird situation. So the idea that he's ISIS, no, I don't buy it. That said, there are plenty of other terrorist groups. Al Qaeda, for example, Osama bin Laden, Saudi Arabia. A lot of the attackers, 13 out of the 19 attackers in 9/11 were Saudi-born. I'm just saying. And Saudi Arabia still happens to be one of our allies in the region. Some ally who keeps... I'm not saying they're sending terrorists over. I'm not going to pull a Donald Trump here. They're sending us they're terrorists. No. It's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that extremist Islamic fundamentalism that we see in Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis, well, they're dangerous. And yet we're still allies of their government. Really kind of a strange thing. So he went to Saudi Arabia, he came back, he brought a wife. Right? But he was born here. So he fits into that category of the 58% of born-and-bred jihadis. But once again, I want to point out that you are more likely to be killed by a right-wing domestic terrorist in America. And I'll get into that later, of course, in another story. Now let's get into more stuff about this, right? Let's get into what irritated me that I had mentioned earlier about the Syrian refugees. Now, 52% overall, according to this poll, said that the United States should not accept any Syrian refugees. That's a majority. That's a clear majority. 42% said, yes, we should take it. So at least 42% of Americans are saying, yes, we should open our homes and our hearts to Syrian refugees. But 52%, they don't understand that the terrorists that they fear from overseas are what these refugees are running from. Something doesn't click. I don't know what's going on. I don't know why, but it just doesn't seem to resonate here. And here's the thing. 16% of Americans said that they were worried about terrorists embedding themselves with the refugees. And yet, 52% said that we shouldn't take any refugees at all. That is a weird disconnect. That is a really strange disconnect. I don't understand it at all. I don't get it. Now, on a partisan basis, when you break it down by partisan lines, Democrats say 68% to 23%, yes, let's take in the Syrian refugees. Republicans, 84% to 14% say no, don't take refugees. And among independents, 46% supported and 49% opposed taking those Syrian refugees. Despite the fact that most Americans, 84%, said we're not worried about terrorists lurking among the refugees. We're more worried about the domestic terrorists. 58% all worried about domestic terrorists, born and bred domestic jihadists. Yet let's not take in any Syrian refugees. That makes no sense to me. People don't know what the fuck's going on. They just don't know. That's irritating to me. All right, now, finally, 6 in 10, 61% said that they're worried more about the government not going far enough to protect the country than they did about the government encroaching upon their personal freedoms. We've seen this before. So 6 in 10 people are saying the government isn't doing enough to keep us safe, and we'd be okay with losing some of our personal freedoms to keep us safe. No, that's not what we do. That is not what America does. America is supposed to stand in the face, look fear in the face, and then spit in its eye. That's what we're supposed to do. We're America. We're not supposed to be afraid of terrorists. We're not supposed to be afraid of anybody. But apparently, a lot of people say, no, the government must take away our freedom. 6 in 10. We don't care if they take away our freedom as long as they keep us safe from the terrorists. And yet, here's also the funny thing that goes along with that. Well, we end up not doing anything about gun control. Oh, come on, man. I know a lot of that has to do with Congress. Most Americans support doing something about gun control, background checks, etc., right? But there's just a weird disconnect in this poll. I don't understand it at all. Now finally, 83% of voters say that it is very likely or somewhat likely that terrorists will strike in the U.S. in the near future. Well, that we continue to assure every day. We continue bombing Muslim countries. So you bet your ass I agree with that. We're just asking for it by bombing innocent people. Some innocent people, we get a lot of innocent people when we actually also go after the bad guys. I don't have a problem with going after the bad guys. I do have a problem with going after the bad guys and hitting innocent people. Now, if you're Ted Cruz, or if you're Ted Cruz, you don't give a fuck, right? But civilian casualties, unavoidable. But if you're Donald Trump, let's intentionally go after their families, the terrorist families, and bomb the shit out of them. Now, you can see the compassion just overflowing on the right. Overflowing like a river. My cup runneth over. Unfortunately, your cup is filled with bullshit. And hatred. This poll, as I said, it's frustrating. It's frustrating to me. We're still more likely to be killed by a homegrown right-wing domestic terrorist. Whether or not they're Muslim, that happens. There's obviously a risk of Islamic terrorism in America. There's also a huge risk of Christian terrorism in America. Why are we focusing only on the Muslims? I say we focus on all facets of terrorism. And we focus on it without compromising our own freedoms and our own liberty. Remember, they hate us because of our freedoms. Well, we've done a damn good job at letting the terrorists and the government take away our freedoms because we're afraid. Let's stop being afraid. Let's stop being afraid and really stand up to the terror by not being afraid and by protecting our freedoms. Let's be Americans.